That's the type of crap that's been going on in schools all over the country for a little while now. And the other part of the problem is the mainstream media. Washington Post, I'm looking at you. Check out this op ed from the Washington Post when this got published 3 days ago. Parents claim they have the right to shape their kids' school curriculum. They don't. Oh golly gee, isn't it just a coincidence that this came up as Virginia's governor's race is about to really be decided based on stuff that's going on with the schools? Guys, Terry McAuliffe might actually lose the governor's race in Virginia all because of this issue. So of course the Washington Post is running interference for him. Let's read this op-ed. In their search for issues that will deliver Congress in 2022, conservatives have begun to circle around the cause of parents' rights. In Indiana, Republican Attorney General Todd recently introduced a Parents' Bill of Rights, which asserts that educational policy and curriculum should accurately reflect the values of Indiana families. In Florida, the legislature passed an even more comprehensive bill assuring that the state and its public schools cannot infringe on the fundamental rights of parents. A growing number of states are allowing parents to sue school districts that teach banned concepts, and in Virginia, here's the real problem. Republican Glenn Youngkin has made parents a centerpiece of his campaign for governor, staging Parents Matter rallies and declaring parents should be in charge of their children's education. Now, can you imagine a land? So a couple things as we make our way through this article. Number one, we have to always remember, and this is something that Sloan Ratchmus said on my channel a couple weeks ago, we have to always remember that every single time that we are talking about what is going on in the public schools, we are talking about the government. Every single time the public schools are brought into the equation, we have to remind ourselves that they are government-run schools. They are government-funded schools. They are government-staffed schools. They are government-run schools. We need to start thinking of the two of them as interchangeable. Because the greatest trick that the teachers' unions ever played was convincing us that teachers are not government employees. They are employees of the state. They are pushing the state agenda, and the state compels your children to go to those schools. Unless you have an alternative like homeschooling, which you should all be doing if you can. So we always have to remember that. But I also find it a little ironic that people have the gall to tell parents that they should just have no say over the education of their children. I don't know how many parents we have in the chat. I don't have kids, but I sure as hell, if I did, wouldn't be allowing anyone to tell me that I have no right to have a say in how my child is educated. But this is in the Washington Post. Let's keep going. Given this frenzy, one must reasonably conclude that radicals are out to curtail the established rights that Americans have over the educational sphere. Who are the radicals in this case? Who are the radicals? The people who are, does the Washington Post consider parents who want to be involved in their kids' education the radicals? Or do they consider the schools who don't want their parents involved in kids' education radicals? Because the schools seem a whole lot more radical to me than the parents do. Yet what's actually radical here is the assertion that of parental powers that have never previously existed. I'm going to read that again. Yet what's actually radical here is the assertion of parental powers that have never previously existed. That is not to say that parents should have no influence over how their children are taught, but common law and case law in the United States have long supported the idea that education should prepare young people to think for themselves, even if that runs counter to the wishes of their parents. Now, of course, the problem, as we all know on this channel, is that the schools are not teaching children how to think for themselves. They're not doing that at all. The schools are indoctrinating children into a far left progressive ideology, showing them no other view of the world, and doing this from the time that they are in pre-K. In the words of legal scholar Jeff Schulman, this effort may well divide parents from child, but not because socialist educators want to indoctrinate children, but because learning to think for oneself is what children do. So what they're saying is like, the schools may make your children little socialists, but it's just because they're thinking for themselves. Your kids are just learning how to have empathy for others in schools. And that's why they're becoming little socialists. It's because they're thinking for themselves. It's really the parents who are trying to prevent children from thinking for themselves. It's not the schools. It's the parents. The reason we learn, hi Deb, I don't know too many 6-year-olds begging to be told they might not be the gender they thought they were. I think that's an interesting, yeah. I don't know too many 6-year-olds who are begging to be taught that either, or begging their teachers to do a gender identity spectrum chart on the chalkboard. It's crazy. When do the interests of parents and children diverge? Generally, it occurs when a parent's desire to inculcate a particular worldview denies the child exposure to other ideas and values that an independent young person might wish to embrace or at least entertain. To turn over all decisions to parents, then, would risk inhibiting the ability of young people to think independently. They're arguing that parents just want to shelter their kids, and therefore the schools have to be responsible for exposing kids to other ideas that the evil parents just don't want them exposed to. As the political scientist Rob Reich has argued, minimal autonomy requires, especially for its civic importance, the child to be able to examine his or her own political values and beliefs and those of others with a critical eye. If we value the end, the structure of schooling cannot simply replicate in every particularity the values and beliefs of the child's home. No one's asking for that. The problem is that children are graduating from the public schools completely unable to think for themselves. Completely unable to think. Deb continues, if that's true, they should have no trouble giving equal time in school to the view that marriage is between one man and one woman and that sex is binary according to biology. Let them choose. Well, of course, we know that's not being taught in the schools. And listen, I have no issue with gay marriage. I don't have an issue with trans people either. But I think the point that Deb's making is that if this is truly about teaching people to think for themselves and just presenting the facts and letting people make up their own minds given the evidence, then all positions should be presented. But of course, we know that's not what's going on in the schools. What happens in the schools if a student accidentally misgenders a classmate? Maybe one of these kids that has suddenly come to the realization that they're trans or non-binary, and their classmates have known them as one thing their entire lives, but all of a sudden, like next year, they come home from summer and they're completely different, or they come back to school rather from summer and they're just a different person, and the kid accidentally misgenders them. You know what happens in the school? That kid that accidentally misgenders them is given a really stern talking to at absolute best. Because they're not doing those things. They're not. Let's keep going. The law has long reflected this. Consider homeschooling, which, by the way, if you're interested in homeschooling, you definitely want to check out Deb's channel, The Reason We Learn. She's the homeschool guru. But by the way, they're going to be going after homeschooling next. They're going to try to outlaw homeschooling next. Just you wait for it. Although, here, they're even going to talk about it right here. Consider homeschooling. Although it is legal across the country, states still regulate its practice. Such regulations often aren't enforced, but they certainly are on the books. Homeschooling parents can be required to establish minimal academic qualifications to submit examples of a student's work to school district administrators or even adopt a state approved curriculum. As the Supreme Court noted in Wisconsin v. Yoder, a case that's granted Amish parents the widest possible exemption from state control, there is no doubt as to the power of the state having a higher responsibility for education of its citizens to impose reasonable regulations for control and duration of basic education. And as the court made clear in an earlier case, Pierce versus Society of Sisters, the state concerns itself not just with the well-being of the child, but also with what the justices broadly call the public welfare. The sudden push for parental rights, then, isn't a response to substantive changes in education or the law. It's a political tactic. Writing in the 1960s, historian Richard Hofstadter observed that conservatives felt that the country had been taken away from them and their kind, and that time-worn American values had been eaten away by cosmopolitan intellectuals. In response, they took up what he called the paranoid style, an approach to politics characterized by heated exaggeration, suspiciousness, and conspiratorial fantasy. Well, turns out many of those conspiracies actually turned out to be true, but where I will agree is that I think conservatives play this game extremely poorly. I think conservatives spend a lot of energy screaming about things that don't make a difference. I think that conservatives don't fight the battles that should be fought. I think conservatives generally act as controlled opposition to the left, just saying everything the left does is bad without presenting a vision for the country of what they want to achieve. On that, I can absolutely say that I don't think conservatives do a good job. The paranoid style of politics is particularly useful as a mechanism for organizing opposition, and the Republicans employing it right now have two particular targets in mind. The first is the public education system, which hardliners have long sought to undermine. Well, to be fair, this isn't just Republicans. If I had my way, and as we all know, I was a Republican for about 15 minutes, I had a one-night stand with the Republican Party before I decided that, I just had too much to drink the night before and it was a bad decision. And when I woke up the next morning, I saw that it wasn't what I thought it was. So I had a one-night stand with the Republican Party, and yet I think the public education system should be absolutely abolished. I am extremely accelerationist in this regard, and so are most of the people that I talk to, and most of them are not Republicans. At an annual cost of nearly $750 billion, tuition-free open enrollment education represents one of the nation's most substantive commitments to the public good. But well before Ronald Reagan's failed attempts to introduce vouchers in the 1980s, conservatives were making the case for a privatized system, one in which families, not taxpayers, would bear the cost of education. Well, that's not entirely true, is it? Because what they're saying is that the dollars should follow the student. The dollars should follow the student. That student wants to go to the public school in their town? Fine. That student wants to go to a completely different school? That works too. And what is this deal with one in which families, not taxpayers? Are they saying that families are not taxpayers? I'm sorry, but last I checked, families paid taxes. I pay property tax, 3/4 of which goes to fund the public school in my town that I don't even use because I don't have kids. Do I not have to pay property tax? Actually, that's something I'm going to try to do in New Hampshire. I'm going to try to nullify paying property tax. I think it's a good idea. Anyway. And governance would happen through free market rather than democratic politics. The two options are not actually free market versus democratic politics. Why should democratic politics impact what's been taught in the schools? Conservative legislators across the United States have introduced bills creating education savings account, private school tuition tax credits, and other forms of neo-vouchers that package old ideological wine in new bottles. So the question that we should all ask, because remember, when it comes to the public schools, that's the government. Why does the Democratic Party and the Washington Post and the progressives and the woke left, why do all of them want so badly for the government to control education? That's the question that we should be asking. Why do every single one of these groups want the government to control how children are educated? Not parents, the government. Why is that considered preferable? Because the political right doesn't want this. Libertarians definitely don't want this. Libertarians don't want the government involved at all. People on the political right, at least usually minimally, want people to have a choice where they go. Why is it so critical to the Democratic Party that the government be in charge of educating your child? But this play is much bigger than education. For years, the Republican Party has understood the demographic tide is against it. Knowing that every vote matters, the GOP has relied on a strategy of voter suppression. Simultaneously, Republicans have worked to ensure that their base turns out in force by stroking white racial grievance. And I'm actually shocked beyond belief that white is capitalized because they usually don't do that. The recent firestorm over critical race theory is a perfect case in point. Never mind that this concept from legal scholarship isn't actually taught in K through 12 schools, or that it isn't what most protesters believe it is to be. You know what's funny? I actually almost pulled this up, but then I realized it was like from back in June. The Myth-Informed account earlier this week tweeted out a resolution from like the National Mayors Association where they resolved that critical race theory absolutely should be taught in public schools. We know Kimberly Crenshaw herself led a several-day conference a couple months ago called Critical Race Theory Summer School, in which there was an entire track about critical race theory in the schools. So the Washington Post lies again. Homer Simpson says, "Let's go, Brandon." Absolutely. Republicans gain an electoral advantage by convincing their base that white children are being taught to hate themselves, their family, and their country. That's all true. Whether this supposed attack on the American way of life is being coordinated by Black Lives Matter activists, Marxist educators, or Antifa operatives, the point, as Hofstadter observed, is to generate an enemy thought of as totally evil and completely unappeasable. Well, you know, a broken clock is right twice a day, and Richard Hofstadter is not wrong. But that doesn't mean that the woke left is not totally evil and totally unappeasable. Of course they are. Courts have found that parents have great authority when it comes to deciding how to raise and educate their children. This right does not mean that public schools, government, must cater to parents' individual ideas about education. Parents can opt out of public schools if they wish, and they should, and pay to send their children to private or religious schools. But even there, parents' rights remain subject to state regulation and override. Well, actually, parents actually have less rights when they send their kids to private schools. They have less rights. So Deb makes this point all the time. But like, if you're thinking about sending your kids to private schools, man, just take that tuition money and hire a private tutor. Homeschool with a private tutor. Because you're gonna have a much more control. You have less control over your kids when they're in private schools than you do when you're homeschooling. In framing our public schools as extremist organizations that undermine the prerogative of families, conservatives are bringing napalm to the fight. They may rally the base and tilt a few elections in their favor. Yeah, they're probably going to tilt that one in Virginia to their favor, it looks like. But with any scorched earth, these people have some nerve. We're going to talk about who wrote this article in a second. But these people have some nerve claiming that it's conservatives who are doing the scorched earth strategy. Listen, I have my issues with conservatives. I've already voiced a few of them in this here video. But it is not conservatives who are implementing the scorched earth strategy. It's the woke left and the Democratic Party. But as with any scorched earth campaign, the cost of this conflict may be borne long after the fighting stops. Parents may end up with a new set of rights, only to discover that they have lost something even more fundamental in the process. Turned against their school and their democracy, they may wake from their conspiratorial fantasies to find a pile of rubble and heaps of ashes. I mean, I can only speak for myself, but I wouldn't be disappointed to find the Department of Education in a pile of rubble and heaps of ashes. Figuratively, of course, not literally, YouTube. Figuratively. I wouldn't be disappointed at all to find the Department of Education in a figurative pile of rubble and heaps of ashes. Dare to dream. Well, let's look at who wrote this here opinion piece. Jack Schneider is an assistant professor of education at the University of Massachusetts Lowell. Jennifer Berkshire is a freelance journalist. So we should listen to a journalist, and a professor of education at the University of Massachusetts. Okay. Okay.